Right now, as you are watching this, there's a fault line sitting roughly 70 to 100 miles off the coast of the Pacific Northwest that is capable of producing an earthquake so powerful it would make anything California has ever experienced look small by comparison. It is not the San Andreas. Most Americans have never even heard its name. It is called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and new research published just this year has revised the risk associated with it upward, not downward. Today, we're going to break down exactly what this fault is, why it's fundamentally more dangerous than anything in California, what brand new science published in 2026 just changed about how bad the worst case scenario actually is, and why the millions of people living directly above it may be facing something the country has never truly experienced in its modern history. If you want to understand the real risk picture along the entire West Coast, not just the fault everyone already knows about, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we cover breaking geological research like this constantly. Let's get into it. Most people who've heard anything about West Coast earthquake risk have heard about the San Andreas Fault. It's famous, it's been in disaster movies, and it runs directly through some of the most recognizable cities in the country. But the San Andreas is what's called a strike-slip fault, meaning two chunks of the Earth's crust are grinding past each other horizontally. That's a dangerous kind of fault, but it's not the most dangerous kind that exists. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is something else entirely. It's a 620 to 700 mile long convergent plate boundary running along the seafloor from northern Vancouver Island down through Washington, Oregon, and into northern California. Instead of two plates sliding past each other, one plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, is slowly diving underneath the North American plate in a process called subduction. That might sound less dramatic than two plates grinding against each other, but it's actually the mechanism behind the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on Earth. This is the same category of fault that produced the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan and the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, both megathrust events along subduction zones, both among the most catastrophic natural disasters of the last century. The movement along Cascadia is agonizingly slow, barely the width of a fingernail each year. But that slow, grinding motion doesn't release its energy gradually. The plates lock together at the surface, unable to slip smoothly, while the deeper crust keeps moving. All of that unreleased motion gets stored as elastic stress in the rock, building for centuries at a time, until the friction holding the locked section finally gives way and releases everything at once. Why this fault is categorically worse than the San Andreas. Here's the number that should reframe how you think about West Coast earthquake risk entirely. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is capable of producing an earthquake of magnitude 9 or greater. The San Andreas, even in its absolute worst case, most catastrophic multi-fault rupture scenario, tops out somewhere in the range of magnitude 8. The difference sounds small on paper. It is not small in reality. Remember that the magnitude scale is logarithmic. Each full number represents roughly 31 times more energy released, not just a modest step up. The difference between a magnitude 8 and a magnitude 9 is not slightly worse. It's an earthquake, releasing dramatically more energy over a much longer rupture length and for a much longer duration. When a Cascadia megaquake finally happens, current modeling suggests the ground could shake violently for as long as 5 minutes straight, across a stretch of coastline running from Northern California up into British Columbia. For comparison, most damaging earthquakes people have experienced last somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds of strong shaking. 5 minutes of sustained, violent shaking is a different category of event entirely, one that gives structures no real chance to survive an initial jolt and then stabilize. The shaking simply doesn't stop long enough for that to happen. And unlike an inland strike-slip fault, a subduction zone rupture displaces an enormous volume of ocean floor vertically as it slips, which is exactly the mechanism that generates massive tsunamis. Modeling for a full-length Cascadia rupture suggests tsunami waves could reach up to 100 feet high in the most exposed coastal areas, arriving at some communities in as little as 15 to 20 minutes after the shaking starts, before any official warning could realistically reach them in time. How often? This actually happens. This is not a theoretical, once-in-a-planet's-history threat. Researchers studying sediment layers off the Pacific Northwest coast have found geological evidence that more than 40 earthquakes greater than magnitude 8 have struck somewhere along the Cascadia zone over just the last 10,000 years, and at least 19 of those were roughly magnitude 9 events that ruptured the fault's entire length at once. The last full-length rupture happened in the year 1700. Researchers know this date with startling precision, not just from geological sediment evidence on the American side, but because that earthquake generated a tsunami large enough to cross the entire Pacific Ocean and strike the coast of Japan, where it was recorded in written historical records as an orphan tsunami, a wave with no local earthquake to explain it, because the earthquake that caused it happened thousands of miles away on the other side of the ocean. Japanese coastal villages recorded flooding on the night of January 26, 1700, with no felt shaking beforehand, a detail that puzzled local chroniclers at the time and remained unexplained for nearly 3 centuries, until modern geologists cross-referenced those written Japanese records against sediment layers found buried along the Pacific Northwest coast. That cross-continental detective work is part of what allows scientists today to date the last Cascadia megaquake down to a specific night, rather than a rough century-long window. Full-length ruptures along Cascadia happen on average every 450 to 500 years. It has now been 326 years since the last one. Oregon's own Department of Emergency Management currently estimates roughly a 37% chance of a magnitude 7.1 or larger event striking this zone within the next 50 years. Other federal hazard modeling puts the odds of a magnitude 8 or larger rupture at around 15% over that same 50-year window. These are not small numbers when you're talking about an earthquake, capable of producing what experts have directly called the worst natural disaster in the nation's history. What just changed in 2026. Now here's why this story matters right now, specifically, rather than being background information you could have heard 5 years ago. New research published this year has revised the scientific understanding of Cascadia in ways that all point in the same direction. The risk is larger than previous models suggested, not smaller. One major study published earlier this year used marine geophysical surveys, the widest survey of the Cascadia Subduction Zone conducted to date, to map variability in the fault's underlying structure along its full 700-mile length. What researchers found is that the hazard is not uniform along the fault. Certain segments show meaningfully higher risk characteristics than others, and understanding that segmentation is now considered essential to accurately assessing what a future rupture could look like. Critically, the same research found that the fault could potentially rupture in pieces rather than as one single full-length event, which actually cuts both ways. A segmented rupture could in some scenarios produce a smaller earthquake than a full-length rupture, but it also means multiple, separately damaging events could occur closer together in time than older models assumed. Separately, other 2026 research examining Cascadia's coastal impact found something researchers describe as even worse than previously feared. When a Cascadia megaquake finally strikes, entire stretches of coastline in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington are expected to drop or subside by as much as 6.5 feet almost instantly. Coastal communities that survived the initial violent shaking could then find themselves permanently below sea level, with floodwater seeping in and staying, effectively drowning towns that made it through the earthquake itself relatively intact. This new modeling suggests the number of people, structures, and roads at risk from this subsidence-driven flooding could be more than double what earlier assessments had estimated. And there's a third, deeply concerning line of research that's emerged just this year. Scientists have found new evidence suggesting that the Cascadia Subduction Zone and the San Andreas Fault, two of the most dangerous fault systems on the entire West Coast, may be more connected to each other than anyone previously believed. This research suggests the two systems can, in rare circumstances, synchronize, with one fault triggering a rupture on the other within minutes to hours. If that synchronization scenario ever plays out, it would mean not a single massive earthquake, but a rapid, connected sequence of major earthquakes hitting multiple regions of the West Coast in very close succession. A scenario far more complex and far more damaging than the one big earthquake in one place, scenario most emergency planning has traditionally focused on. To be clear about what this research is and isn't saying, none of this new science predicts an imminent rupture. No scientific tool that currently exists can predict earthquakes with the specificity required to issue a meaningful short-term warning, and that remains true for Cascadia exactly as it's true for California. What this research changes is the picture of how bad the eventual worst case could actually be, not when it will happen. What a Cascadia megaquake would actually look like on the ground. A 2022 joint state and federal planning exercise modeling a full Cascadia rupture estimated roughly 14,000 fatalities and more than 100,000 injuries across the region. Beyond the human toll, the same planning exercise anticipated the collapse of major transportation infrastructure, including bridges and highway overpasses throughout the Pacific Northwest, widespread and prolonged power outages, and the near-total loss of drinking water and sewage systems across the affected coastal region. Oregon's own state emergency management agency is remarkably direct about what recovery would actually look like. With the region's current level of preparedness, officials anticipate residents in the hardest-hit coastal areas being without basic services and outside assistance for at least 2 weeks, and in many communities, considerably longer than that. This isn't a hurricane scenario where relief supplies can be trucked in along an undamaged interstate within a day or two. Many of the roads and bridges needed to reach the hardest hit coastal towns are themselves expected to be destroyed or rendered impassable by the earthquake, meaning some communities may be entirely cut off, reachable only by air or sea for an extended period after the event. Part of the reason Cascadia doesn't dominate the public imagination the way that San Andreas does comes down to something almost embarrassingly simple. It's been quiet for the entire span of recorded American history. The last full rupture happened in 1700, nearly a century before the United States existed as a country. There's no living memory of a Cascadia megaquake, no black and white newsreel footage, no grandparents' account passed down through a family. California, by contrast, has produced damaging, newsworthy earthquakes throughout the entire era of American media. From 1906, San Francisco, through Loma Prieta in 1989, and Northridge in 1994. That steady drumbeat of visible, documented California earthquakes has shaped public perception of where the real West Coast risk lives, even though the geological evidence increasingly points toward Cascadia as the more catastrophic threat when it finally goes. This is precisely the kind of gap between what scientists understand and what the public has internalized that tends to produce the worst outcomes when a disaster does finally strike. A population that has spent centuries not experiencing an event tends to underprepare for it relative to a population that gets regular, tangible reminders, what other megathrust earthquakes have already shown us. Because Cascadia hasn't ruptured within recorded American history, one of the most useful things scientists can do is look at what's actually happened when comparable subduction zones elsewhere in the world have gone in the modern era, because the physics are the same even if the geography isn't. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan is the closest real-world parallel available, and it's the one seismologists studying Cascadia return to constantly. That earthquake, a magnitude 9.1, struck along a subduction zone off Japan's northeastern coast, a tectonic setting essentially identical in category to Cascadia. Despite Japan having some of the most advanced earthquake engineering and tsunami preparedness infrastructure on the planet, the resulting tsunami killed close to 20,000 people and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The earthquake itself, brutal as the shaking was not what caused the majority of the casualties. The tsunami that followed it was. That distinction matters enormously for how Cascadia risk should be understood. The shaking is dangerous. The wave that follows it, arriving in minutes rather than hours, is very likely to be the deadlier part of the disaster for coastal communities that don't reach higher ground in time. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake offers an even starker illustration of subduction zone megathrust power. That magnitude 9.1 rupture along a fault system off Sumatra generated a tsunami that killed over 230,000 people across more than a dozen countries ringing the Indian Ocean, many of whom had no meaningful warning system in place at all. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded human history, and it happened along precisely the same category of fault that sits off the Pacific Northwest coast right now. Neither of those comparisons is meant to suggest Cascadia will produce identical casualty figures. Population density, building codes, and warning infrastructure all differ significantly between those regions and the modern Pacific Northwest. But both events demonstrate something essential about subduction zone megaquakes specifically. They are not simply a stronger version of the earthquakes people are used to. The tsunami they generate is frequently the deadlier half of the disaster, and it arrives on a timeline measured in minutes, not hours, which is exactly why evacuation route familiarity matters as much as the earthquake preparedness itself. The infrastructure and funding gap. Nobody wants to talk about. Here's an uncomfortable reality that rarely makes it into casual conversation about Cascadia risk. Unlike California, which has spent decades building out extensive seismic retrofitting programs, statewide early warning systems, and strict, regularly updated building codes specifically calibrated to its known earthquake risk, the Pacific Northwest's investment in Cascadia-specific preparedness has historically lagged well behind the scale of the threat researchers have identified. Many older buildings throughout coastal Oregon and Washington, including schools, hospitals, and fire stations in some of the most vulnerable coastal communities, were constructed before Cascadia's true hazard potential was even fully understood by the scientific community, which only emerged clearly in research from the 1980s and 1990s. Retrofitting that older infrastructure to withstand 5 minutes of sustained, violent shaking is a dramatically more expensive undertaking than retrofitting for the shorter, sharper shaking typical of a strike-slip fault like the San Andreas, and funding for that work has consistently trailed behind what emergency planners say is actually needed. Some coastal fire stations and school districts in the region have made real progress in recent years, but officials themselves acknowledge that the overall pace of retrofitting across the region remains far slower than the scale of the identified risk would call for. This is precisely the same dynamic we've discussed on this channel when comparing Venezuela's earthquake outcome to Japan's. Geology sets the scale of what's possible. Decades of infrastructure decisions, made or deferred well before the ground ever starts shaking, determine how survivable that event actually turns out to be. Cascadia is a textbook case of a region where the science has moved faster than the infrastructure investment needed to match it. What you can actually do about it? If you live anywhere in the coastal Pacific Northwest, from Northern California through Washington State, this is not a threat you should treat as abstract or purely academic. Know whether your home or workplace sits in a designated tsunami inundation zone, and know your evacuation route to higher ground without needing a map or an app to figure it out in the moment, since a Cascadia tsunami could arrive in as little as 15 minutes. Keep an emergency kit built for a minimum of 2 weeks of self-sufficiency, not the standard 72-hour kit typically recommended for other disasters, given how clearly officials have stated that outside assistance could take that long to arrive in the hardest hit areas. Know the earthquake safety basics, drop, cover, and hold on. And make sure every member of your household does too. And if you're in an older, unreinforced building, it's worth finding out whether any seismic retrofitting has been done, since building performance during 5 minutes of sustained violent shaking is a very different engineering challenge than surviving a shorter, sharper jolt. For decades, the story most Americans have been told about West Coast earthquake risk has centered almost entirely on California and the San Andreas Fault. The geological evidence increasingly suggests that story has been incomplete. A fault capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake, 100-foot tsunamis, 5 minutes of continuous violent shaking, and permanent coastal subsidence that could drown towns that otherwise survive the shaking itself, has been sitting quietly offshore for 326 years. And new research published just this year says the risk is larger, not smaller, than scientists previously believed. It has not rewritten the timeline. Nobody can predict exactly when this fault will finally rupture. But it has rewritten the scale of what happens when it does. We'll keep tracking every new piece of Cascadia research as it's published, along with anything new coming out of California's fault systems in the meantime. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it. Drop a comment and tell me if you live anywhere near the Pacific Northwest coastline, and whether this is a threat you'd already heard about before today, or whether the San Andreas Fault was the only West Coast earthquake risk you'd ever really been told about. I read every one of these. Stay prepared out there, and I'll see you in the next one.